First, Sadiq and Ibrahim, before we bring Riyadh on. Okay, I'm not sure they can hear me, but I'm going to start anyway since we're about 10 minutes behind schedule. Salam, Sanbonani, Molweni, Namaste, Vanakkam, and welcome to this episode of The People's Voice, produced and presented by your host, Shabnam Palesa Mohamed for Salam Media, a humanitarian journalism platform, broadcasting live from eThekwini, Durban, South Africa. If you're joining us, you are on Facebook Live via the Salam Media page, the Salam Media website, Listen Live, the Salam Media or TuneIn app, or free-to-air decoders, or you could join my watch party, which I'm about to start now, from the Salam Media page, so that if you are on my Facebook page, you'll be able to follow and engage us in conversation today. So let's look for the video, and I'm sure Ibrahim and Sadiq are on top of it. So we'll be able to start the watch party. There we go. We've got the watch party, loving the technology. And there we go. Watch party on my page about to start. Engage in conversation. Perfect. All right, so today we're in conversation with TRT World Digital Director, a news social media specialist, as well as strategic media shift speaker, Riyadh Minty. But let me give you his extended bio in a second. Riyadh Minty, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to The People's Voice.
Walaikum salam, thanks for having me.
Most welcome. So let's tell you about Riyadh. He's the Director of Digital at TRT, the public broadcaster of Turkey. Previously, he founded AJ Plus, one of the world's largest news media publishers for a digital generation in San Francisco as part of the Al Jazeera Media Network. Riyadh spent a decade co-creating the network's global strategy as the head of social media. He regularly speaks at conferences and universities around the world on the shifts within the media industry. He joined TRT in Istanbul in 2016 to help build its digital network. TRT World, of course, is one of the 14 TV channels and 16 radio channels. So Riyadh, let's get straight into it. You've achieved what can be described as a meteoric rise in the global media space. So take us through the seeds, the milestones, and the highlights of that journey.
So thanks for having me on the show. I think often I get a lot of credit off the back of other people's work. It's, a lot of this, it would be not fair of me to say that, I've taken that massive rise just by myself. I think it's been a lot of different teams that I've been blessed to work with. A lot of amazing people on, the different sort of teams over the years. It's been an interesting journey. I think that over the years, I've learned a lot. And I think what I've learned most is that it's a journey where you continue learning. With media and within the digital media space, there is no real right or wrong answer. Things are continuously adapting, things are continuously changing, the industry continuously changes, new technologies come out as younger audiences become more and more
We're back, Riyadh. We've got some gremlins happening here today, but please continue.
So where did I get cut off last?
You were talking about the younger audiences.
Yep. So as younger audiences come in more online, I think that there's new habits that people kind of start adapting to. The way in which we consume media is continuously evolving. What I found and learned over the way is that our values and how we are as generations are all consistent. And what we look into and what we look into consume and how we look into engage within our communities, within the broader world is all pretty much the same set of core values. But technology means the way in which we're engaging is very different. And I think, like, for example, you're hosting a watch party on your Facebook page right now. So the way in which we're able to engage with topics and people has changed dramatically over the years. And I think my personal journey, I mean, if I was to answer that, I think if I was to summarize it, a lot of failures, A lot of mistakes along the way, a lot of learning through those mistakes, a lot of support from family, friends along the way, and just being blessed to be part of amazing teams. There's a lot of ideas that are out there. Having an idea is easy. Everyone has thousands of ideas every day that you can come up with, but being able to actually implement it takes a lot of hard work from a lot of people behind the scenes who you don't often hear from. And being able to surround myself with really talented people through the years who I've been able to learn from and continue to learn from has probably been one of the biggest things in terms of that outward success that people would say.
Alhamdulillah, we've got quite a few people joining us today, so we'll be looking forward to their comments and questions for you. But Riyad, you founded AJ Plus, right? And it launched on Facebook with a short text on-screen news alert and mini explainers on politics and social issues. You were also the head of the network's social media strategy. What achievements at AJ Plus are you the most proud of?
So AJ Plus for me, it's I think the fact that people, I left AJ Plus a long time ago, and I think that fact that people still quote it, and I think it took on a role of more of a media organization. I think it became sort of a brand that represented a voice that was somewhat unheard around the world, specifically for younger generations. And I think for me, that was very much at the heart of what we wanted to achieve with that, where we heard that, or always told that young people don't care about the world, they don't care about news, they don't care what's happening out there. And for me, it was that actually young people care, if not the same, if not even more, because we all want to build a better world and tackle the challenges that we have. It's just that news was never presented in a way to these audiences or younger generation, which they could relate to and how they could take that into their everyday life. And for me, being able to see that take a life of its own, not just within AJ Plus, but globally, and seeing a lot of media organizations copying that format, a lot of media organizations trying to start up, and even till today, people that I meet will all come say, "How can we do an AJ Plus kind of thing?" And the answer I give to them is not about always that format, the text on screen format. It's understanding your audience, and it's understanding how people want to consume, and coming up with innovative ways to do that. It's not as simple as I'm going to put the text on screen on a video and put it online and people are going to watch it. Like, if you're not paying attention to your audience, where you get into that space, that's where most media organizations fail. So for me, that's probably the biggest success, is just seeing how people around the world have been able to connect with us and connect with the story, which is something personal to me. And just seeing how people have taken it to a new level, and even being able to leave AJ Plus and to sit back and see it continually grow from success to success over the years. That's also very dear to me, to be able to build something that can take a life of its own, even once you kind of move on. And I think that goes back to the first question of it's not one person's success, it's a team of people who always do this. Yeah. And so, yes, I might have come up with the idea, but the phenomenal growth and everything that has come since that has been with the team that's been there, that's been able to kind of take that core values and build on it.
Wisdom and teamwork from Riyad Minty. Your comments and questions for him on my watch party or on the Salam Media live video would be amazing to engage your thoughts and questions with him. So Riyad, since 2016, you're now the Director of Digital at TRT, which is based in Turkey. And its motto is "Where News Inspires Change." Tell us about the channel and its TRT World Citizen project.
Sure. So I started off initially working at TRT World to kind of launch the news channel, English. Shortly after that, we launched the Arabic channel, and the last year and a half, I've now moved on to the rest of the TRT network, which news is one vertical. We focus on a lot. We have sports channels, we have entertainment channels, a lot of drama shows. We have an art and culture channel, we have a documentary channel, and we're a pretty big organization. We're probably the second biggest public broadcaster in the world after the BBC. We're also the only broadcaster that sits on the board of the European Broadcasting Union and the Asian Broadcasting Union, which I guess fits Istanbul, kind of straddling between two continents and two worlds. So TRT World, where news inspires change, I think the overall motto of TRT is to inspire people and put the human, put us as humans at the center of every story, and trying to reconnect around our values. And I think at the core principles of what we're trying to do is build a media organization that's very value-centric, that no matter where you are in the world, no matter what interest you may have, be it if you're only in news or you're looking for drama shows, whatever it is that you're looking for, TRT can kind of take those values and able to connect us around our shared humanity. And that's very much at the heart of what we're trying to do. That's into our news channels, TRT World specifically, sort of very humanitarian approach to how we want to approach things. TRT World Citizen is sort of our CSR outreach of the network. and that focuses on working with people around the world. We have projects called Journalism for Juniors, where the team that works on that does training with refugees in Turkey and around the world on how they can start telling their own stories. We host an awards for sort of change makers in the media space who've done interesting work in the year every year. So there's a number of projects that sit under sort of that humanitarian wing within TRT and TRT World Citizens specifically.
Brilliant, very interesting. But Riyad, before I talk to you about how you're managing or how TRT is managing the lockdown challenges, I'm quite interested in the arts and culture aspect that you mentioned just now. Can you share a bit more with us on that?
Sorry, you were breaking up. Can you just repeat the question?
Your arts and culture platform on TRT World. Can you share more with us on that?
So TRT2, it's a Turkish channel. So it's based obviously in Turkey. It's not international, but it focuses purely on art and culture. So it's kind of traditionally art, or the art world is seen as sort of highbrow and inaccessible in the sort of space. And the channel aims to kind of reinvigorate a love for art and storytelling, because I think art is very important in telling our stories across different spaces and how you define art. But be it from filmmaking to paintings to storytelling, these are all forms of artwork that exist out there. And I think for us, it's very critical in terms of how we kind of want to build and work within this world. Art helps us tell the story that sometimes words can't. And I think being able to kind of take that onto a scale, it's our newest channel. We launched it last year. Very colorful channel. It's very exciting to watch. It's in Turkish though at the moment.
Right. I'll certainly be tuning in and brushing up on my Turkish. I love what you said about art being able to tell stories that sometimes words cannot. Absolutely relate to that. Okay, so how is TRT successfully navigating through the COVID-19 lockdown challenge? It presents challenges for news, for media, for broadcasting. How are you dealing with it? How is TRT working through the challenges?
So for us, as a public broadcaster, I mean, we call public broadcasters around the world, it's known as public service media. And I think the fact that we here, our objective is always to serve the public. And so with everyone being under lockdown or, stuck at home, wherever they may be in the world, we also have a role to play in, from a news perspective. How do we inform people of what's actually happening out there? How do we navigate all the information that's flowing? When people are scared and massive changes like this happen, there's a lot of uncertainty that goes on. There's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of fake news, a lot of rumors that get spread very quickly on WhatsApp. And I see a lot of that happening till today. And that's coming from a place of anxiety and uncertainty that exists in the world. I think a lot of the time, what we try to do is also help people understand that the conversations we need to have around COVID aren't as linear or one-sided as people would like to think. Obviously, being under lockdown, you have to take these precautions because of the nature of the virus. But that doesn't mean that doesn't come with other challenges. It's not one or the other. And often, right. I think within governments, as they go in through and making these decisions, there's always a risk assessment of how do you kind of manage this. And for us to be able to communicate that these are multiple challenges that can coexist within the same space is not one or the other. I think that's very important. And I see a lot of the time people see it as one or the other. Oh, we're going to be locked down and then this is going to happen. Of course, there's a cause and reaction for that. But both can be serious issues that we need to be tackled. It's not like let's just kind of go out there. So as a media organization, we'll always try and contextualize a lot of that. We also aim, so from an education perspective, we've done a lot in the digital side, because obviously everyone is at home. How do we start using digital platforms to start engaging with people a lot more? So we launched our own sort of Netflix style platform domestically in Turkey at the start of lockdown. That went incredibly well. We reached, I think, the first day over 7 million people installed the application. And we worked with the Ministry of Education because obviously schools were closed. So we worked with the Ministry of Education. We used our studios to start producing classes for all the different grades. And we put all of those onto our own platform. And for kids, they were able to get free data to be able to watch and stream these on their mobile phones or through computers. So that was quite a successful project in terms of, through COVID, how do we use technology to still keep children being educated even though they're at home. We know, not everyone is up to homeschooling. Parents have a lot of challenges also in terms of your everyday life that parents may have. So being able to provide a few hours a day where kids are able to sit and learn something has been very important for us in that sort of space. So that's on the that side. And then on the media side, we have a lot of drama shows that are very value-centric, and I think people at home also looking to pass their time with different spaces. So from our drama shows to documentary to whatever we could do. Domestically, obviously, we have a lot of that online, but we decided to release a lot of that on digital platforms in different languages. So we get around 6 languages at the moment for our drama shows. Some of our documentary shows are online in English and Arabic with subtitles. And we decided to make those freely available on YouTube. Because we also realize not everyone is in a position to be able to afford a Netflix subscription or Disney Plus subscription, wherever they may be in the world. So we're trying to see how can we be that network for the next 5 billion people around the world, and not only catering to centers of power that may traditionally exist. So where we see there's a need and people can do that, we obviously have the resources and scale to be able to do this. And that's very much at the heart of when we talk about the values that we want to communicate out. It's also the values that we as an organization like to take on through our strategies, and how we then make our content more accessible to be able to connect people around the world, wherever they may be.
So the 3 most interesting things I pick up from what you're saying is, one, that the station is, or the channel is, not linear in its thinking. And I think that's incredibly important after a discussion I've recently had also with Tembise Fakure, your previous colleague at Al Jazeera, and the role of media and journalists in democracy and human rights. But also your value-centric, TRT's value-centric approach and accessibility being at the core of everything that you do. So I think that's certainly very, very interesting. And let's hope we get some comments and questions on that. I see we've got some of the regulars on and some new audiences today, which is fantastic. Riyad, how does South African media compare in terms of digital strategy and social media? What are we doing well, and where is there space for more strengthening and development, and how?
So I've been out of South Africa now for almost 15 years, so I don't think it's fair of me to sit in Turkey and comment on South African media just because I'm not engaged in that space specifically. I know I get this question quite a lot, and I think that every country, every media organization has different levels of maturity, because historically we've had a number of challenges from apartheid and kind of building as we've come out of that sort of different spaces. I can speak to that. I know this was covered recently on sort of the media broadcasters. My late uncle, Amin Ekelwaya, was one of sort of the pioneers of independent media in South Africa. And when I go back and read and listen to some of the things that he spoke about in terms of what he was trying to achieve through the Indicator and his publication, those same values are still true today. I think in terms of sort of the struggles that we're going through in understanding where we need to be able to adapt. In terms of South African media, there's a quote from Feral Hafaji that was beautiful, and I think really hit the nail on the head, is that the reality of South Africa is that you have one South Africa tweeting and one South Africa not eating. And I think that really sums up, I think, South Africa and a lot of countries around the world, that yes, while we do want to go more digital and want to be in this sort of space, it is still very much sort of in middle to upper class sort of approach, those of us who are on digital platforms, and it's not always representative of a broader society. And I think for media, as we become more and more digitally savvy and more digitally engaged, obviously business models are changing, and we've seen a lot of struggles in South African media at the moment around business models, financial sustainability. It's not cheap to run a media organization, and that's going to be a challenge. I think for communities to be able to support their media organizations through donations, whatever they can, is going to become more critically important. But I think that as we continue to grow, to always remember that as a citizen of whichever country we're in, we need to be representative of all the voices that may exist within that society, not just that are able to tune in and stream or join a watch party, because there's a lot more voices that are out there that may have opinions that often don't get heard. And I think that we need to be doing that sort of space to get out there and tell those stories. And I think that in the age of WhatsApp and how quick information spreads, I think that media organizations need to take a leading role in guiding people in how to actually fact check and verify information. And also in how do we actually debunk a lot of the myths and false information that's been spread out there. It's not, I'd like to see a point even for us as TRT and news organizations where we don't just jump on this is what we do know and claim to know everything. I think that right now the world is so hyper-connected where we can be a lot more honest and say, okay, this is what we don't know right now about this. We're still trying to confirm it, and kind of have a more open, honest conversation with our audiences is critically important. And that's not just to South African context, to a global context.
Refreshing views there from Riyadh Minty. Nawawi Matthew says, wow, very interesting show. So according to Digital News Reports 2019, under 35s are spending more time on Instagram and YouTube, 25% and 24% respectively. What impact does this trend have on the media landscape, Riyadh, in your view?
So I think it's sort of the digital native approach. So I think that I kind of come from a generation that I kind of know a life without the internet, or in sort of my teenagers, I had dial-up to kind of get into that sort of space. But I'm sort of that early adopter generation that the older that I'm getting, I'm a digital native. So, as I get into my 40s or 50s, I will still be using technology, and what platforms I'm going to be using in the future don't exist yet. Because this generation who grew up with digital platforms, we haven't reached that age point yet. So I think there will still be space for new platforms to emerge and grow and will continue. And when you go back through history, if you look at, if I talk about Orkut or High Five or a whole lot of other platforms, Dignation, that might have existed that had hundreds of millions of users in their day, they don't exist anymore.
Right.
So, technology continuously changes. You have new platforms like TikTok emerging for younger audiences. So sort of that under 35, it's not completely under 35. I would say it's probably 24 to 35 age group. Under 24s are more on TikTok or Snapchat, and, sort of this different age group. And as those younger generations get older, get into sort of a different space, the way in which they engage and which platforms they go to will evolve and change over time. Facebook is obviously the dominant player, owning WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, and a number of other companies. So we don't often see it as though we're using a Facebook application, but they are sort of the giant in that space. And then on video side, YouTube is still the dominant player. So, you have your subscription services, but YouTube is still sort of the biggest player that's out there. And YouTube is probably the one that's able to transcend generations and ages, that I think every age group is consuming YouTube, whereas other apps might be more specific to age groups.
Sure. A very comprehensive response there. I know you give conference talks about shifts in media. You're also very passionate about a generation of enabled youth. What value do you think youth bring to media?
Energy, creativity, and I think a sense of change. I think, now when I speak to my team, I remember what it was like when I was 22 and starting, and I was coming up with ideas and people were shooting down my ideas a lot of the time because I was young. And now I'm kind of in that space where I need to be the person shooting down ideas of the younger team. And I always kind of tell my team that, sometimes even if I say no, it's no because organization, maybe we can't, the idea is still good, and go and find a creative way and prove us wrong. That's, I think, what's there. And I think that sometimes I have to say no, and sometimes I would tell people, just don't ask me the question. Like, if you feel it's a good thing, go into it, and it's better to ask for forgiveness and permission sometimes, just because I know what it was like in that sort of space. So I think younger people, the challenge, I think, is that with the age of social media, we've become very much linked to the industry because of Instagram, whatever it is, where we do things looking for that instantaneous hit of a like, where we just feel good about ourselves because of the more likes that we get. And that's been translated into a workspace also right now, where people come in and they want that immediate feedback or the pat on the back for everything that you do, which is obviously, yes, if you do great work, that should be there. But in order to innovate and grow, I think there has to be a high appetite for risk and failure. And so, with AG Plus, all the projects that I've worked on, we've probably failed hundreds of thousands of times before we got to something that was a success. And if we were looking for those immediate likes of feedback, yes, I did this and it's great, and now it has to work because it's the first time I did it, that's not going to be a successful project. So I think younger generations bring that creativity and that energy, but that also needs to come with an appetite for failure and making mistakes, because if you're not making mistakes, you're not going to grow and you're not going to develop in that sort of space. So I think that's it. Yeah.
No learning without mistakes, high appetite for risk and for failure. Absolutely agree with that. Let's talk about media transformation, Riyadh. It's a subject that's very close to my heart in the different spaces in which I operate, whether that's radio or events. We look for representation. We look for women. We look for people of color. We look for people with special needs or different abilities, etc. And we notice when that's not there, and it has a certain impact on brand loyalty as well. It certainly does. The world wants more representative storytelling, and that's a direct quote from yourself. What's been achieved for diversity that reflects the audience both in front and behind the camera, firstly? And secondly, how do media advocates and people who are serious about this representation make sure that the focus is consistent?
So I think, I mean, I'm talking from a position of privilege, being a male in this industry. And I think that is a very big privileged position where generally when you look through leadership around the world within media spaces, generally it is a very male dominated space, and the people making decisions are men. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and acknowledge that privilege that does exist within that space. And I think for me, it's important to whatever space I may be in and whatever privileges I may have, to use that to be able to open the door for the next generation of people, be it through recruitment or be it through training, so that we can have more diversity, be it male, female, or even in terms of religion, wherever people may be in terms of identity, in positions of leadership. So it's not just about having people in the newsroom or on your teams working in this. It has to be positions of leadership. And if we're not getting to a point where we have positions of leadership, then that's the biggest challenge. So, I mean, I can talk to small successes that we might have had, but I mean, from my side, there's still a very, very long way to go. And I think that collectively, it's a challenge that we face globally. I think even within our own media, within our own local media spaces, it is still something that's a challenge that's out there. And I think that for us as men to also know to be able to step out of the way is important. And I think to be able to give a chance to new generations to be able to step up, because often when we do that, we will see that, these projects will scale. And I can tell you, AJ Plus is under the leadership of Dima Khatib, who's the managing director and sort of the first female director at Al Jazeera. And, once she took on that role, she's done phenomenal things with the channel and been able to scale it to new heights that I think that it's remarkable. And I think that for us sometimes to be able to step out of that and give that space is important.
Takes that courage is important and does have impact. So let's move from there to talk about the Turkish series Ertugrul. 15 days to reach 1 million subscribers of the Urdu translation series. And last week it was in the top 50 of the most watched YouTube channels. What do you believe is the secret of its success? Why do audience buy in? Where's the loyalty coming from?
So Ertugrul's had an interesting round of success globally. I think the South African craze kind of happened last year, I believe. And some people are still catching up watching it or even rewatching it. That was with the initial release on Netflix. It's available in 6 languages. So Urdu is doing phenomenally well at the moment across Pakistan, India, and sort of Urdu-speaking communities around the world. It's available 6 languages, including Russian, Spanish, Arabic, English, Turkish, and we've done 1 episode in Swahili.
Wow.
I think, so yeah, we've reached at the moment in Urdu, it's about 3.5 million subscribers, 250 million views. Globally, the channel at the moment has probably reached around over 60 million unique people around the world. And it's close to, I guess, about 800 million views. So getting close to 1 billion views just for the show, which is remarkable. I don't think, we knew the show was successful, but this sort of level and scale and the speed at which it's happening is incredible. I think there's multiple reasons why it's successful. One of them, I think, is the identity perspective. It's the first time where we've seen a different kind of hero, where, the show people are praying their salah, they quote in hadith. You have Ibn Arabi as a spiritual guide going through and guiding people. And it doesn't shy away from its sense of identity. It's very much rooted in that. It's rooted in a historical narrative that did exist a few hundred years ago. And so I think that being able to connect to our history and being able to see people who may look like us and sound like us and speak like us, being the heroes of the story, it's the first time we've seen that in a high quality production. And that's challenging a lot of narratives that we would normally see coming out of Hollywood or Bollywood in that sort of sense. And I think for us within sort of our drama space, we're trying to focus on that quite a lot. And that's been one of the biggest factors. And a lot of people talk about, the Muslim audiences and how people are coming through, but we've also seen a very large non-Muslim audience from people across Latin America and everywhere around the world who've tuned in to watch the show, and they love it just because the values are very universal values. And I think that often when we talk about our Islamic values, sometimes we focus very inwardly and think it's an exclusive thing to us as Muslims. But I think the beauty of Islam, and I think the beauty of the lessons that the Prophet ﷺ taught us, is that our religion is for all humanity. And I think the values that people are able to see and resonate in this, regardless of their faith or their identity, is very much a human value that's at the center and core of what we have, be it from justice, be it from standing up against injustices, be it being standing up for the poor, standing up for what is right in society. And these are universal values that anyone around the world can relate to. And I think that's really what the show has tapped into. It's been remarkable. I mean, just every day, just seeing sort of the audiences around the world and the responses that have been coming through. And I think that people are looking for an alternate. And I think that what the show does prove is that often we'll look at your Hollywoods and everything that's out there and think, oh, look at what they're doing. And it's easy to be on the side of criticizing, but until we're able to actually step up and provide an alternate, all these sort of other narratives will continue to exist. And I think that what we've seen is when people do step up and you're able to provide an alternate, it's not always amazing, not always great, but it's in trying to kind of change things. Audiences are ready and people are waiting for it. People are willing to consume. And I think we need to be investing a lot more, going back earlier in terms of art and sort of how we can use art to kind of tell this sort of story and connect people, connect hearts, connect minds, connect people around a common identity. Is something that is powerful. And I think that's really at the heart of the show. And I think the success is really just, it's the fans and that level of connection to it.
Fascinating. Lots of loves and likes floating across the screen, and a personal thank you from Mushtaq Sheikh, who's probably one of the biggest Ertugrul fans I've yet to encounter. And we've got a couple of other people joining the show as well. And I think it's very interesting that the show has transcended beyond one perhaps objective, perhaps not directly, but countering the Islamophobic narrative, but beyond that, to connecting hearts and minds and this interfaith, intercultural sense of unity and solidarity, which is amazing. Now, Ramadan has seen some interesting projects. I've got a comment for you from Nazir Jamal. Before we move to your Ramadan projects, Riyadh is a legend. My original Ertugrul ring was a gift from him. May Allah bless him.
Yes.
I think you would know Nazir quite well. So let's talk about the Ramadan projects. Ramadan Photo a Day project is now in its 9th year. What inspired this concept? How's it developed since then? And what is this year's focus?
So Ramadan Photo Day, it's interesting that it's coming up in the interview. It's a project that a bunch of friends decided to work on 9 years ago. We all enjoyed photography. Someone once posted sort of a daily challenge onto Facebook, Majram Patel, and it was sort of this list of words and take a photo for the day. And we got together and said, why don't we do this for Ramadan? I mean, there's 30 days in Ramadan, 29 or 30 days. Come up with a word a day and see if we can explore the month through sort of a visual medium and kind of reconnect with different spaces in our everyday life. And for me, a big part of that inspiration was a talk I heard once where they said, when you go through the 99 names of Allah and you look at that, you need to be able to find the creator in the creation. And I think being able to find the beauty and how Allah may manifest sort of the different bounties that is given to us sort of in our everyday life. And so through a visual medium, can we kind of pick up on that and identify these sort of spaces? So every year goes through a different theme. This theme was actually inspired by my wife, Farjana, because we're under lockdown. So within these spaces, the different things that we have, it's a time for introspection. So can we choose a word? And how can that word be interpreted to a greater value that we may be able to see? So while we're all collectively going through this lockdown, wherever we may be in the world, let's find a space for sort of expression. I think today's word is baking in possibility. That's the word for today. And it's just really take a photo of how you can interpret that in your life. And it's just great to see how people are willing to share and just sort of insight. It's a small community of people. It's around, I think, 5,000 people on Facebook at the moment. But every year it just surprises me just being able to connect with people around just sort of the shared interest in sort of storytelling.
I found the focus on inner and outer this year to be particularly interesting. So inshallah, it's a project I'm going to attempt next Ramadan. I'm sure it will still be around in its 10th year, 10-year anniversary. It's fantastic. So the other Ramadan project that I picked up from your social media space is the Ramadan Tent project, which hosted a global 24-hour iftar across 5 countries with incredible guest speakers like Dalia Fahmi, Riz Ahmed, and yourself. What is the objective of these meaningful but also very ambitious events, right? And what's the impact?
So the Ramadan Tent project, I was just invited as a guest. So the Ramadan Tent team are based out of the UK and it's become a global event. It started off organizing massive iftars in the UK where people may not have had families or spaces to go to, so they could come together and have a shared experience, but also to open up the concept of iftar for people who are curious to know what do Muslims go through during Ramadan. So come together and sit and let's have a fast, break our fast together and let's have a chat and you can get a bit of a taste of what the Ramadan atmosphere is like. And over the years, I've been following the sort of the real world approach, and it's been phenomenal to see that the way in which people connect around us. And I think in Istanbul there have been some iftars like that also, where people will meet up in front of one of the big mosques and just bring some food, and let's all just share and kind of go through the space. This year, obviously under lockdown, is a different space, and the organizers decided, can they cover iftars around the world, because as we follow the sun, every hour there's an iftar happening kind of as you go around the world. So starting all the way from the east all the way to the west, and it was quite an ambitious project from their side. And it was, from my side, just very great to be able to be part of that conversation, to be able to share with that community, and just to be able to have a conversation with people around the world at iftar time and kind of reflect on things that, not, we always do get into sort of the success, and people look at the numbers and the projects that you work on and all these sort of things. But I think for me, it's always important to take a step back and reflect on the meaning of why we are here and why all of this exists and why we do this. And the Ramadan 10 project, I think for me, was sort of the conversations that we had there were a lot more personal and reflective over sort of the deeper meaning behind why we wake up every day and do what we do in the media space.
Thank you. It sounds like a beautiful project. Alhamdulillah for that. Last question, Riyadh, before we let you go. What's next on your horizon, the achievement of which we'd love to see perhaps in a biography someday?
So I don't think I'm that kind of space. As I think I'm often get the credit for a lot of other people's work. So I think the stories that need to be written need to be about the people who've been able to connect about the stories. It shouldn't be about any one person. And I think that for me, just to be able to wake up every day, be grateful and show up as best I can today and do the best I can in whichever role or position I may have, and how I can use that to open the door for the next generation of people to come through. That's sort of next in my story. I don't have a long-term plan. Take it one day at a time. And alhamdulillah, I've had a lot of blessings through the years. And if I'm able to open the door for other people to come through and share my experiences, so it may inspire other people to come through, that's the most important thing to me. Because right now, I think globally, there's a lot of people from the Muslim community and from minority groups, wherever they may be in the world, that aren't necessarily represented in these spaces. And I think for me, just being able to be part of that story and keeping that door open so we can have more people coming through and having even more amazing stories than mine to be able to tell and share with the world. That's kind of what I'd like to focus on.
Insightful, inspiring, and empowering. Riyadh Minty, it's been an absolute pleasure being in conversation with you today, the Director of Digital for TRT World. Blessed Eid, greetings to you and your family, and we look forward to seeing more of your work in the media space. Assalamu alaikum.
Thanks. Walaikum salam.
All right, that was Riyadh Minty in conversation with us today. Certainly a very interesting conversation for people in the media space, but also for people that want to know more about the media space, how it works, how it shapes our lives, our everyday lives, our democracy, our human rights, and our very existence. In the second half of the show, we are in conversation with Yusuf Ismail, and I will ask my wonderful tech team to bring him onto camera for us while I tell you about him. So Yusuf Ismail is an attorney for the past 14 years, specializing in criminal law. He's a consultant, a public speaker, and a debater for the IPCI. He's also the host of a TV program entitled I Beg to Differ. Founder member of an association of legal practitioners called Lawyers for Constitutional Democracy, which aims to uphold the Bill of Rights and the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa during the COVID-19 lockdown, and also plans to challenge the constitutionality of the National Command Council. Certainly an interesting conversation, and I believe we're taking a break. Sadiq just informed me. In the meanwhile, your comments and questions, either for, well, Riyadh's just left us, but perhaps post-show he can pick up some comments and questions. But your comments and questions for Yusuf Ismail, I mean, we're talking about the Bill of Rights versus the lockdown. That's essentially what a number of people are talking about. And I'd like to make the point that it's not a linear conversation or a binary conversation, in the sense of, if you have concerns about the lockdown and its impact on the non-elite, the abuse of human rights, the poor people that are starving, the SMMEs that are going out of business, it doesn't mean that you don't care about the right to health and about people being healthy and being well. Often when you bring up some of these issues, you're told, well, do you want people to die? And that's really not the kind of conversation we need to be having. It's far more nuanced and complex than that. So certainly we need to be having this conversation. If you have thoughts about how the Bill of Rights that we have entrenched into our minds for the last 26 years, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the right to dignity, the right to freedom of movement, the right to equality, the right to earn a living, the right to safety and security, etc. It's what's been ingrained into our consciousness as South Africans. So certainly it's a conversation that needs to be happening. Yes, we're in a time of COVID-19 lockdown. Does it mean that the Bill of Rights can just be suspended? And if so, by who? Who gets to make that decision that the Bill of Rights is suspended and decides which right you can have and to what extent? Is it justifiable in the circumstances in which we find ourselves now, almost 7 weeks post-lockdown? What are some of the examples that we're seeing around the world of people who are now questioning, can you have a Bill of Rights or a constitution in a time of a virus or a pandemic that's affecting the world? Does it need to be suspended? Should we give up on our rights? Should we accept any amount of a violation of human rights that's thrown at us? I mean, Mr. Khoza was murdered by the SANDF, and that matter went to court as well. Quite a stern rebuke from the presiding on that particular matter. But tomorrow it could be you and I. It could be. And therefore, it's very important for us to be able to make sure that the Bill of Rights is entrenched and continues to be at the forefront of everything that we do. We have achieved immense gains as a democracy in the last 26 years. Some people might say the Bill of Rights, it's a paper tiger. It exists in theory only. It's nice to talk about and to hear about and to receive awards about. But in reality, in a society where we have the largest income mountain between the elite and the rest in the world, does it really work? What does the Bill of Rights mean to someone who is sitting on the pavement, homeless, and wondering where their next meal is going to come from? Does the Bill of Rights mean anything to someone who is beaten up by an army officer or a police officer or a private security officer? How are you going to make that person feel better? Take out the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and say, well, you have it, here it is. You have these rights. It actually will make absolutely no difference to them. So the Bill of Rights needs to be an everyday lived reality, a lived experience. And part of that, intrinsically, is us holding to account the people that we elect or are elected as public servants. Otherwise, the Bill of Rights means absolutely nothing. We can kiss it goodbye and never ever talk about it again. So we're going to be in conversation with Yusuf Ismail. Sadiq will just let me know if we are done with the ad break. And of course, we're going to need a bit more time with Yusuf Ismail, seeing as though we started today's show 10 minutes late due to the technical difficulties with the links. But I'm interested in what he has to say. What do you think? Do we need to challenge the constitutionality of the lockdown regulations? Are there regulations you agree with, regulations you don't agree with, that you feel are a violation of your human rights? Now's your chance to speak out. And let's talk about the National Command Council. There's certainly enough literature and opinions out there I've seen in the last couple of weeks in particular, saying that the very structure and the powers of the National Command Council are unconstitutional. And everything in a constitutional democracy has to be constitutional. So I'm curious to see what Yusuf Ismail is going to be saying to us and what responses he and his team of legal practitioners, an association actually called Lawyers for Constitutional Democracy, what responses are they getting? Are people supporting their challenge to the presidency and the Minister of Health? Or are people saying, look, we're going through enough now. We don't need you to go and rock the boat and challenge anything. Don't you care about humanity? Don't you care about human rights? So I'll be curious to see what he's got to say on that. And I see we've got a number of people on my watch party. And let me just, oh, there's a lot of them. We've had Hawa, Dr. Ed Rawat, Ranesh Ramprasad, Duran Munsami, Prasheen Maharaj, Imran Kassam, Nirod Bramdew, Peter Rippon, Joe Grant, Mustaq Sheikh, David Jones, Kumari Devi Ramprasad, Sudhindra Naidu, Fayaz Akub, Juanita Balkisun Chitepo, Naveen Rupnarayan, Mohammed Shanawaz Wali, Nawawi Matthews, Sean Ramsami, Malin Naidu, Arshad Mehta, Raveen Singh, Ajay Brown, Terence Chetty, Mohamed M. Khan, Bongile Kumalo, Nisha Chandika Prasad, Sarfaraz Easter, Tukole Ibrahim Gatti, Akram Ahmad, and Bilkis Kastareen Mohammed, and Vishad Singh. Yusuf Ismail, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the People's Voice.
Assalamu alaikum and good salams and peace and greetings to your listeners and your viewers, Shabnam. It's good to be on your program.
Good to have you on. So I've done your introduction in the meantime, so everyone knows who you are, and I've created some context for us about this very important conversation and the need to move away from this binary of either you care about health or you care about human rights or you care about the economy, because I think it's dangerous and we need to be a lot more nuanced and complex than that. But let's start here. The country is under the COVID-19 lockdown. Everybody's stressed, right? And if you ask, some people may still say the government is doing the best it can and have absolutely no criticism, because we seem to have lost that voice of dissent magically that we've had over the last 26 years. Why write a letter to the president entitled Demand to Lift Lockdown and Invalidate the National Command Council?
Well, that goes actually to the heart of the issue. I think what we're seeing essentially in the South African context is clearly what has always been there for the past 26 years, but more particularly now, strangely enough, under the administration of Cyril Ramaphosa, the descent into fascism. I mean, you made the telling point that there was very little dissent at the outset. On the 27th of March, people were basically praising Cyril Ramaphosa for standing up and boldly declaring that the country go into lockdown for a period of 21 days, which obviously changed. But I opposed it from the inception because I knew, and many, not that I know a lot, but many within civil society are aware of, in fact, what this government is capable of and what the history and the background is. So I knew at the outset that this was essentially the lockdown in itself was essentially a disaster. The lockdown and the steps basically happening. But what's happening now, more particularly, Shabnam, is that you have a growing number of individuals, and not just necessarily from the social movement organizations, but individuals, the general public, the everyday man, standing up and essentially dissenting and seeing that this is essentially not sustainable. More particularly when you see the wholehearted level of abuse that's essentially taking place, where you have, the problem at the outset is this. What logic is it that it would essentially tell you that to cure a medical crisis, you go and deploy the military. But you deploy the military not for purposes of essentially providing the necessary relief in terms of providing a degree of support structure to, for example, medical personnel. But you deploy the military and you deploy the armed forces with guns pointed at the population. That is a totally strategic disaster, particularly in our context, the South African context, where, for example, you would have a situation of 2,000 people living in a squatter camp altogether, or a situation where in some of the poorer townships of South Africa, this is absolutely not sustainable. And so the point is, at the end of the day, is the Disaster Management Act, certainly in its present form, in its gazetted format, which generally is reserved for national disasters, having not to do particularly with pandemics, but more specifically with climate-related and with human-induced disasters. Why was the present pandemic dealt with under that specific act when you've got alternative regulations and legislations? And what are the reasons as to why a declaration of a national state of disaster in fact occurred in the first place, which inevitably led to a whole host of constitutional violations? And more particularly is that the DMA, or the Disaster Management Act, does not in actual fact contemplate dealing with a disaster without declaring a national state of disaster. And finally, more particularly, was there a rational connection between the regulations that have been imposed, and they seem to be changing on and off. You have Cyril Ramaphosa saying one thing, the Minister of Kokta saying something else. I mean, on the tobacco issue, those are all minor aspects. But this basically goes to show that there is no clarity or consistency in some of the regulations being pointed out, and more particularly, no rational connection has been shown between a lot of the regulations that have been passed by government, the law enforcement officials' conduct on the other hand, and even the purpose of government intervention, as clearly stated in the Disaster Management Act. It's not just simply, police officials. You've got an individual, a rather pompous character by the name of Fikile Mbalula. I mean, at the outset, for example, you had a situation where those who do not have the necessary licenses for their vehicles, there's obviously a kind of a leeway until the end of the national disaster or the lockdown ends. And you had strangely a situation at the outset, at the beginning, at the commencement of the lockdown, where he boldly made the claim that this individual needed to be arrested and obviously that his vehicle needed to be impounded. Now, this is essentially a recipe for disaster. When you can say, on the one hand, that someone walking in isolation on the street can potentially be arrested, but you have a situation where thousands of people can queue to receive rotten food from the government, or pension payout queues are more larger now than has ever been before, or you have a mass accumulation of people at the mall by virtue of a lockdown. This clearly shows that this is not a thought out process. This is an inconsistent approach by government. And essentially, and now it's coming to light. I mean, it has come to light globally, but now particularly if you look at the report, which I've seen in the Sunday Times by Dr. Glenda Gray, where she points out that there is no scientific
Yusuf, I want to pause. I want to pause there.
this.
I want to
Yeah.
pause there because we're going to get into the 4 grounds which are listed in this 20-page
Sure.
letter and unpack them. So let's talk about this letter. It's a 20-page letter. It's got 4 grounds. It includes 4 grounds upon which the demand to lift lockdown and invalidate the NCC is based. And that's legal, medical, economic, and humanitarian. But before we unpack them, who is Lawyers for Constitutional Democracy representing or speaking for? Is there a mandate for this, or do you just feel it's in the public interest, it just needs to happen?
Well, Lawyers for Constitutional Democracy, it's basically, we consider ourselves legally informed citizens of the Republic of South Africa. And we've come together not on behalf of our legal practices, but specifically in our personal capacity. It comprises of academics, advocates, and attorneys that are basically coming together. And what we would say is that when you talk about mandate, we would implicitly articulate the views of most of the South Africans, including various groups, individuals from different sectors of society, different religious organizations, people from different cultural backgrounds. But there's no specific mandate given to us to say act for on our behalf. We are doing what we believe is the proper and right approach to adopt, which is an approach not just simply adopted by us, but by many other individuals in South African society, some of them not articulating it expressly. But we had, a few weeks before this letter, we had 2 counsels from the Johannesburg Bar that had written a polite and kind and articulate letter to government. And they received a response which was downright demeaning and insulting. And so our letter is not polite. Our letter is not basically respectful. Our letter takes a bull by the horns and goes out and on an all-out attack. And this was sent last week Friday, and not surprisingly, there's been no response, and there will be no response because the facts contained herein, they're not facts that we are making up or thumb-sucking, but the facts contained are in fact irrefutable. There's no response to them, and not surprisingly, government will not respond.
So as it stands, there's been no response to this 20-page letter, which certainly raises even greater issues as to why. Why would the presidency not respond to this letter from civil society? But let's move on from there, Yusuf, because we're going to run out of time. Sure. I'll tell you why.
Okay.
The show started a little bit late, and I'm just mindful of getting through our questions because it's a very important conversation, right? Yeah. So let's critically unpack each of those 4 areas. Let's start with the legal grounds. What are the legal grounds for demanding lockdown lift and the invalidation of the opaque NCC?
Well, number one, you've got firstly the wrong legislation that's been decided. We'll come to that shortly, but the wrong legislation has been used in this instance. The Disaster Management Act basically deals, in a general sense, not with pandemics, but with specifically climate-related human-induced disasters. If there's a massive earthquake, or, for example, you have a situation where there is, a mass disaster of some sort. Earthquake would be a classic example, a mass flood, something along that line, but not with pandemic. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you've got this illegitimate and authoritarian entity calling itself the National Coronavirus Command Council. And this entity, which I can call an entity, is operating without any form of parliamentary oversight. But that's just one aspect. Whether if it operates with parliamentary oversight doesn't mean that it's necessarily correct. But more specifically, is operating without any form of constitutional mandate. The bodies engage in decision making and policy enactment. It's determining regulations and levels as they're enacted, and they change. They are arbitrary. They are ambiguous. Now, if you look at in a general sense, in terms of the national executive of government, they've got certain powers, accountabilities, and Chapter 5 of the Constitution specifically gives a mandate to the president that he has the obligation to uphold, obviously, the Constitution, and amongst others, he's got the power to make appointments in relation to that. But more specifically, members of the cabinet are accountable collectively and individually to the parliament for the exercise of functions and performance of the functions assigned to them. At this particular point, the question is, there was no rationale in explaining what constitutional power, government policy, can be delegated by the president to a body that has absolutely no legitimate constitutional existence. And then the other point is that what piece of legislation, because there's clearly none, or what constitutional provision was in fact invoked by the president or the president cited in conferring upon himself the power to appoint the National Command Council. And if those questions are answered, which obviously they cannot answer, it essentially means that you are dealing with a body that is passing laws, and that body is illegitimate. So what happens when you have an illegitimate body that passes laws coming from this illegitimate entity? Then the laws themselves are invalid. And
Correct.
So therefore we are saying, theoretically, an argument can be made that the Constitution was never suspended. It cannot be suspended in disaster management in a general sense. But even in this particular instance, you've got the freedom to movement, the freedom in terms of working, the ability to, for example, just simply walking in isolation, not harming anyone for that particular matter. What basis are these particular rights and regulations in fact suspended?
I've got a comment for you, Yusuf, from Juanita Balkisun Chitepo, and she says, listening to you describe it, it sounds like the government are a bunch of teenagers looking after toddlers and has a crisis which they handled in a panic that put the toddlers in further danger and now behaving in a typically adolescent way, throwing their weight around to save face. I don't think that needs any response, but let's move forward. From there,
I will tell you, she's putting it mildly. I mean, she's putting it very mildly. You've got a criminal enterprise that's actually operating now full swing, but that's another issue.
Sure. So there's a multitude of democratic rights that are being violated during lockdown. What do you say to an argument that the Bill of Rights in Section 36, which is the limitation of rights, are justifiably curtailed during this time only in order to save innocent lives? And as South Africans, we should loyally accept it.
Well, I mean, this was pointed out in the letter at the outset that, the Constitution does in fact allow a situation where rights can obviously be limited. I mean, this stands to reason. Even, for example, the freedom of expression, provided it doesn't impose on, amount to hate speech and, amount to some degree of hatred on other individuals and so on. So there's certainly instances where rights in general can be limited. But the main point is that where a regulation limits any right that is guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, that limitation will only be constitutionally valid if it's justifiable in terms of the limitations clause. Now, there was a case which we cited there in the case of Moisa versus Greater Germiston, the Transitional Local Council. And the judge in that particular court, the Constitutional Court, in fact, explained in relation to that specific case that if a government wishes to defend any enactment, then it has the opportunity and the obligation to do so. But more particularly, the obligation doesn't include just the submission of legal argument, but it has to place before a court of law factual, material, and policy considerations. Now, the question we need to ask in relation to this, what are the factual, material, and policy considerations in terms of why many of these particular rights have been limited? We cited the article by Vuyani and Gulwane, but more particularly Pierre de Vos, Professor Pierre de Vos, Professor George Devenish, who's also a member of the Lawyers for Constitutional Democracy. They raise the issue. And this is just at a simple example. For example, the military-imposed curfew from 8 p.m. initially to 5, and then I think Fikile changed it willy-nilly from 7 to 5. that obviously clearly limits the freedom to movement. Now, the question is, what's the factual basis in relation to that movement? I mean, has there been significant movement of people after 8 p.m. during the lockdown? I mean, the same logic, for example, applies to the restriction of exercise between 6 and 9 p.m. What's the actual purpose of that rule? Is it for convenient policing to ensure that people now can be kept together at a specific time period, and therefore they can be monitored? And if that's just simply the case, that you're having these particular rules and regulations as a mere convenience, then that's never at any stage going to justify a constitutional right. Or stupid laws. For example, you cannot buy, I mean, at one stage you couldn't buy underwear, or you cannot buy open shoes, or you can just simply buy bell bottoms, or I don't know, maybe buy certain pantyhose, whatever the case
A
is.
theater of the absurd, Yusuf. Let's move from there because we've still got 5 questions to go. What are the medical reasons why lockdown should be lifted?
Well, the first point is that we have submitted the issue that Section 27(1) of the Disaster Management Act says that a national state of disaster can only be declared if other legislation does not exist. And I've come across this quite recently in researching this whole issue surrounding the lockdown. I hadn't read it until now. There's the International Health Regulations Act, 28 of 1974. And that, in fact, prescribes significant interventions in respect of dealing with points of departure, provisions in terms of primary infections, diseases, in terms of dealing with travel destinations, without in any way suspending the Constitution or suspending the Bill of Rights or suspending, for example, the right of people just to go out and earn a basic living. But most importantly is that what's now coming out, there was no need for a lockdown. If you look at the data that's been given internationally, and this is not just being thumbsucked, but now it's being recognized, I think Glenda Gray pointed out that the lethality of COVID-19 is on average about 0.2%. That's in the range of a severe flu, but it's 20 times lower than what was originally suggested by the World Health Organization, which is a totally discredited organization, by the way, run by an individual that on 3 occasions denied the outbreak of cholera in Ethiopia. That's another debate entirely. But more importantly, the risk of death for the general population of school, working age, is very, very low. Even amongst the older generation, you've got 70 to 79 years old, 60% remain asymptomatic. 80% of all test positive persons remain asymptomatic. The median or average age of the deceased in most countries is over 80 years old, and only 1% of the deceased had no serious preconditions. Almost everybody, even in our deaths in South Africa, all have previous conditions. And what is more disturbing, and I think you pointed this out, I think last week or a few weeks before, in relation to what's going on, is you're having a disturbing trend in South Africa where people are now going to hospital for secondary ailments, and they are listed as dying of COVID-19, or in certain instances with COVID-19, which means...
Do you know of any of these cases, Yusuf, personally? Do you know of any cases? Have you seen any surfacing on social media?
There is one. I mean, over and above what many experts have pointed out, but there's one case that I know personally, where I had a client of mine who had his relative, a brother-in-law, having what was clearly a heart attack, and he was taken to a private hospital in Durban, and at that private hospital, he died in casualty. He died in casualty, and he had all the symptoms of a heart attack. Somehow or the other, you had a pathology report, and I don't know how they did a pathology report or did a test after his death. I wasn't aware that they do it after the person dies, but they had a pathology report, which seemed to have suggested that he died of COVID-19. But if we have a situation that the infection rate is so high, as we are told on the one hand, none of his family members were in fact diagnosed, and they all tested negative. There was no screening done on them. There was no follow-up. But if indeed he had COVID-19, there would have been a fallout with his family members. There was none. He died in casualty. He died of a heart attack, but he was diagnosed as dying of COVID-19. And I think the point also being pointed out now is that many people are dying as having died with COVID-19, which obviously, I mean, if you, for example, have the common flu, or you have a cold and you die in an accident, nobody's going to say you've died with the cold or you've died with the flu. flu.
Right.
So I don't know what the agenda is in relation to this, but what is important, Shabnam, is that the exponential curves of the corona cases are misleading, and the number of tests also increase exponentially. The RT-PCR test, I might just add before we go on to the next issue, the RT-PCR test does not fulfill Koch's postulates, which is a set of criteria in terms of determining that these are the standards you have to meet before you can register positive. So, for example, if you got the common flu, or you got stomach cancer for that matter, theoretically, you can test positive, even though you don't test positive for the so-called COVID-19. But they pick up the genetic material and the exosome, which is essentially reflective of the fact that you've got some sort of particular ailment, which is essentially disturbing and which has not been looked into by certainly an incompetent government, or certainly whoever's advising government, because we don't know who's advising government. Professor Shabir Mahdi in the Sunday Times says, as part of the medical advisory council, says he doesn't know who's advising government. Who's advising government? Who's actually advising the individuals at this particular point in time? WHO said you can't go back to level 3. You stick to level 4. Zweli Mkhize makes the announcement. You stick to level 4. We can't go down. So what's actually going on? And I think that this is essentially a convenient, expedient use of a virus to take away our rights and freedoms and certainly destroy South African society.
We've just seemed to have lost the watch party for some reason, and I don't know why. But let's continue.
I hope we haven't lost the recording.
Yeah, I hope not. Well, hopefully the station is recording, so we will be able to share this video nevertheless. But what are the economic reasons why lockdown should be lifted?
Well, I mean, it's quite simple. I mean, you've got people, the vast majority of people in South Africa are poor, and they cannot earn a living. South Africa it's a fragile economy. We were fragile initially. We're now more fragile than before. There are approximately 10 million taxpayers, 60 million people. The government is hopelessly unable to take care of South Africans by providing them with an income during lockdown. And people were, the first time, the 27th of March, people were boldly congratulating President Ramaphosa for the 1 billion rands that he had managed to secure by the Ruperts. What people don't even realize is that 1 billion rands was paid to an entity called Business Partners, which is a financially an institution which loans. I would be maybe defamatory to call them loan sharks. I've dealt with them in the past. But that money is paid into this Business Partners, and then you make a lengthy application process in order to justify why you can possibly access part of that loan, like a micro loan, and then after a period of time you actually pay back. So there's no handouts. There's no handouts given. But more importantly is that on an average day, South Africa is losing about 10 billion rands a day. You look at 45 days instead of the original 21 days. Now I think we're sitting at 55 days. We're looking at about 55 billion rands. And this has resulted in the loss of millions of jobs and businesses. What is amazing is that you can go to a busy mall, you can go to Checkers, you can go to Pick and Pay, you can go to all these big retail outlets, and you are somehow or the other not at risk of getting coronavirus, but you have to shut down at the initial stages the average street hawker who didn't in fact get a lot of individuals coming to his particular, was basically living hand to mouth. You're preventing domestic workers from coming to just work at households. Some of them haven't worked for months. But you have no problem when some of these outlets, for example, where people are queuing up for food on a daily basis, and there are thousands, hundreds of thousands at a time. So what you see again and again, this is not a thought-out process. It's clear that government's underequipped to feed the nation. Therefore, the right to work must take a priority over further and continued lockdown, which in any event is not happening in the townships. I mean, I travel in the rural areas on a daily basis.
Can we link what you're saying now into the humanitarian reasons why lockdown should be lifted?
Well, because in the long term, what's going to happen is that the mortality rate as a result of the lockdown, and this is not just in South Africa in the South African context, but in Africa, those that basically impose a lockdown and globally will be far in excess than what the actual mortality rate of the virus is basically causing. I mean, right now there's about 300 and somewhat deaths as a result of what they're claiming to be COVID-19, although the data hasn't been presented. Last year, we had 63,000 people dying in this country of tuberculosis. Now, it's highly unlikely that we are going to see 63,000 people dying of COVID-19 in South Africa. If we're responsible at the very least, but it's highly unlikely. But the ongoing suffering caused by this is going to lead to a humanitarian crisis. And so the humanitarian crisis is the fact that starvation, there's been cases of malnutrition. I mean, I just saw this report in the Sunday Times where Glenda Gray is now pointing out that not in Albert Lutuli, in this hospital in Johannesburg, I forget the name, slips off my head, that there are now cases of large amounts of malnutrition that is basically exponentially increasing. And the reason for this is that people cannot get basic food. And what logic does it tell you that to stay behind doors, you are going to somehow or the other build up your immune system? I mean, that's the argument being put up here. It doesn't make sense. I mean, Dr. Erickson has pointed out that, Dr. Nat Witkowski has pointed out this, Dr. Sushared Bukasdi has pointed this out. Vast majority of medical experts have pointed out that this whole idea of a lockdown doesn't make sense. And let me just point this out. One thing which is very important. We are following what's called the Imperial College model. Although in its modified form. The Imperial College model was developed by an individual called Professor Neil Ferguson, who was a scientist that was advising the UK government. The same individual was an individual who imposed these lockdown rules on the United Kingdom, was during the lockdown period present in the United Kingdom, and was found and exposed by The Guardian and the Daily Telegraph to have had affairs with his married lover during the lockdown period. So you have an individual whose laws and model we are using who doesn't in fact believe it himself. I mean, what are we doing? This is absolutely insane.
I've got a comment here for you from Juanita Balkisun Chitepo, who says, it seems the lack of preparedness of the public health sector was the disaster about to happen, hence harsh lockdown. Now the actual disaster, besides writing letters, what can we do?
Well, I mean, what one we have to do is create an awareness in the public that the reality is, in Islam, and since this is an Islamic station, we have to be positive. We have to build ourselves positively. We have to obviously take the necessary precautions. We have to be responsible, but we have to be positive. When you're faced on a day-on-day basis with ongoing negativity by your government, then not only is it destroying you physically, but psychologically and emotionally. And I think we need to basically create this awareness that at the outset, there is going to be possibly some degree of deaths, but we need to basically ensure that those who are immunocompromised, those who are elderly, those who are sick, you can keep them in some form of cocoon. But for the vast majority of us who have got strong immune systems, and we've got a young population, unlike, for example, Italy, and people are now questioning what's really happening, what happened in Italy, but we've got a fairly young population. The reality is that this virus is not going to devastate the young population in the fashion that starvation or an increased lockdown for the next 8, 9, or even a year will eventually do. We can write to government, we can collectively bolster civil society, and as we have done, written a letter to government and at the outset given them a threat to end the lockdown, or at the very least go back to the drawing board and give us a practical guideline in dealing with a medical crisis and not a gung-ho means in terms of how they've been engaging up till this particular stage.
Last question before we round up here. Yusuf Ismail, what will happen next? Is this group going to court, and will it be joined by anyone, individuals, groups, and organizations?
Well, here's the thing, Shabnam, and this is unfortunate. We talk about the independence of the judiciary. The judiciary in South Africa are very circumspect and are very hesitant on making any decision which amounts to policy recommendations. And there's been unfortunately judgments in this particular regard, which means that if there's a policy decision and the decision taken by the government is essentially wrong, courts are unlikely to recommend the right legislation for government to enact because of the separation of powers. But what we have done is we've called for the disbandment of the National Coronavirus Command Council, and of course, calling for a number of these laws to be done away with. We are seeking, obviously, moving possibly for an application or possibly at a later time because of the risk factor involved, with an application. We're going it in our personal capacity. We don't have funding. We're not a body that have raised fund. We are doing this in our individual capacity. But there may be a necessity at some point to either join as an amicus with the Democratic Alliance and tie up their application because it is lacking in a number of regards. This doesn't mean that we in any way support the policy of the Democratic Alliance. They've had a history.
I bet you thought the day would never come where you would be speaking about the DA as an amicus in a matter you were involved in.
Well, it's unfortunate because, at this particular point in time, where are the gas bags? Where are the loudmouths? Where's the EFF, for example? Where's the other political parties? They should be in the forefront. Is the EFF, for example, that is constantly attacking government and raising quixotic and idiotic objections in Parliament, when we have a situation in South Africa when the constitution of this country is violated and the Bill of Rights and the rights of individuals are clearly violated and people are being killed and murdered by law enforcement officials, and you've got a criminal government in position that is doing what it wants to do, why are they so silent? Why have they done nothing? And unfortunately, the DA has acknowledged that the NCC is operating without legitimate constitutional existence. However, their application doesn't call for the ending of the NCC. What they're doing is just simply challenging one or two regulations. We are saying if we join them as an amicus, as opposed to duplicating the application, we can at least tie up the loose threads, which the application is in fact found to be lacking on a number of grounds. And I may also add that the DA's application is very much of a middle class application concerning about e-commerce and, for example, the rights of people to exercise throughout the day as opposed to, for example, from 6 to 9 or the military curfew from 7 to 5. We are going beyond that. We are saying the rights of the poorest of the poor have to be dealt with. The NCC has to be dealt with in its entirety. And the one advantage with that is that if there's a cost order against us, it'll be borne out by the Democratic Alliance. So we will simply piggyback and let them pay the costs of the application if there is a cost order and the application is dismissed. So it's more particularly an expedient exercise.
It'll be interesting to see where that goes. Of course, we've run out of time. The show has been extended because of technical difficulties today. But the struggle continues, and let's see where this challenge and this defense of the Bill of Rights actually goes. Thanks for spending time with us today on The People's Voice. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
Well, that's our show today. I'd like to thank our guests, Riyad Minty and Yusuf Ismail, our viewers and listeners, and the Salam Media team. Remember to ask yourself every day, what difference am I making? How am I making the world a better place? Revolutionary peace. Assalamu alaikum.